ომი წაგებული იქნა მაშინ, როდესაც აფხაზეთში შევიდა ჩვენი ჯარი.
We lost the war when our troops entered Abkhazia. Why? Because it was a trap in the first place. They lured us into this trap. It was a mistake.
ეს იყო შეცდომა, შეტყუება ამ ხაფანგში.
მე კარგად მახსოვს ეს პერიოდი და ძალიან ხშირად ცდილობენ რომ ეს ასე ვთქვათ შეცდომა.
I have vivid memories of that time. People often tend to blame Shevardnadze for this mistake, so to speak. I must tell you that even though we were all more or less implicated in this grave mistake, probably including Eduard Shevardnadze, it was in reality a setup devised by Russia in advance. It also had concrete implementing agents, notably Tengiz Kitovani.
კონკრეტული შემსრულებლები ყავდა და ერთ-ერთი ასე ვთქვათ ამისი თავი და თავი იყო Tengiz Kitovani.
მაგრამ აფხაზეთში შესვლას
But the entry into Abkhazia was preceded by other processes, such as regular explosions and robberies along the railroad.
ეს იყო ქვეყნის წინააღმდეგ მიმართული ქმედებები, ღვთისა, რომელსაც ბატონი გამსახურდიას.
These acts against the state were carried out by a wing composed of Mr. Gamsakhurdia's supporters. They believed that by eroding Georgia's economy, they could remove Shevardnadze's government. From Ingiri to Adiubja near Ochamchira, they blew up or robbed trains. It was no secret that Armenia's prime minister visited Georgia just to confirm that 7 billion rubles worth of Armenian cargo had been stolen. That's why a decision was made on jointly protecting the railroad network, this issue being run by Ardzimba, by the way. Needless to say, he, being two-faced, said one thing, had something else in mind, and did something entirely different, all depending on his interests. But the Russians also did the same thing.
I
repeat, that was intended as a military operation, including drawings, plans, and so on. It's documented and stored, and I want the population to know what happened in reality. It's all registered, the cases we filed with the court, including plans, drawings, blueprints, and it's all been disclosed alongside the transcripts of his speeches, describing it all and giving fair warning to everyone. They will be prohibited from entering cities and villages. No contact with the population, no disembarking at random, strictly protecting the railroad network. They were not even allowed to jump off to buy cigarettes. They would be supplied sufficiently. He assigned General Uchadze to this project. It's all documented here in the materials. They will be stationed in 3 locations, near Samtredia, Sokhumi, and Leselidze, and they will escort trains. Russia was fueling tensions in both directions, inciting the Georgian side to enter Abkhazia and encouraging Ardzimba to start a war at any cost. Kitovani was assigned to arrive in Sokhumi and introduce Ardzimba to this plan. I spoke with Ardzimba in advance, and we agreed that this operation was a must. But Kitovani dodged the column. As Kitovani was strolling down Sokhumi streets, he noticed a green flag with an open hand and tore it down. The Georgian flag is flying over Sokhumi. Let's go. In other words, it was a taunting maneuver, a textbook case of provocation. As soon as they stepped on the other side of the Inguri and entered the territory of Abkhazia, Russians had separatists open fire. Jabba Yoseliani and I spent 2 days looking for the defense minister. We couldn't figure out where he was. We're told he's in West Georgia, then he's in East Georgia. In the meantime, he walks into the Gali district police station and a shootout starts. This is how the war broke out. It really was a fateful mistake. I should have boarded a plane and flown to continue my conversation with Ardzinba. Then it may have worked out. Maybe not, because they were making ready, preparing for war. Sometimes I would get this feeling that he had different plans in mind for Abkhazia, a different reality, but received total inconsistent feedback. He could not imagine that his former comrades in arms, including from Moscow's Democratic Front, would betray him. 2 ceasefire agreements were signed, and both times Russians breached it, at first by capturing Gagra and in Sokhumi. Now people ask why we believed them in the first place, but we had no choice, did we? The resumption of Sokhumi's assault was preceded by treachery, so typical among Georgians. At first, things got really tense in Samegrelo and beyond. After Zugdidi, they took over Senaki, Abkhazia, all of Samegrelo, then moved in on Poti, marched to Vani, and approached Samtredia. Bad things came in threes: increased escalations and rallies against Shevardnadze in Tbilisi, aerial bombing attacks on Poti, and military action in Sokhumi. You know that during the war in Abkhazia, Gamsakhurdia's armed supporters opened up a second front in the rear, our rear. It was truly tragic to see Georgians stoop so low, no matter how hard one may hate the government. Now imagine someone opening up a second front in Gori, in the rear, to get to Saakashvili. It's treason no matter how badly you may hate him. With the peace agreement signed on Abkhazia, the country was supposed to breathe freely again. In practice, however, we were forced to dispatch half of our armed forces to western Georgia, somehow to ward off these attacks. I have nothing left. My house, garden, everything is burned down. Help. Where were you robbed? 9 Luxembourg Street. Don't be afraid. What do you mean, rob? Please, Mr. Shevardnadze, we're begging you. Are they in your apartment? Tell the boys to help. Execute them and let us watch. Hold on, we'll take care of it in due time. We have no money, and they charge a fortune for food. Keep quiet, I know what I'm doing. Enough with the hysteria. I was supposed to enter Zugdidi a year ago, but you wouldn't let me. Everything would have been fine if you did. There are 4 of us Caucasus leaders, including Yeltsin. And there's a map. He asks me to hand it to him. He unfolds it, and there's a red line passing near the Tsipi tunnel. Let's split Georgia in half. You keep one half, and let Zviad have the other, he said. He suggested that Georgia be split into several parts. You keep Tbilisi, Aslan Abashidze will be over here, Gamsakhurdia will keep this area, and there's also Abkhazia and Skhin Bali region, of course. That was the end of our conversation. You're hopeless, I said. By the way, Aliyev was very vocal. You treat Georgia like this today, and tomorrow you'll do the same to Azerbaijan.
Eduard Shevardnadze.
There's a good expression for it, to set up. They set Shevardnadze up. They promised him everything, but ultimately deceived him.
He
has this habit. Whenever he was angry or needed to compose himself, he clenched his fists like this. That signaled an internal conflict within his mind.
Yesterday,
the Control Commission convened for the 4th time, and they, Patsukhov and other brokers, so to speak, are suggesting that we should capitulate without any caveats. Full capitulation, I emphasize. This is what happens in serious, big politics. They want to bring our small country to its knees, which doesn't seem to be a problem for Russia. But it won't work. Our people will never agree to capitulate. This happened before the fall of Sokhumi. We were fighting tooth and nail to keep Sokhumi and ward off daily assaults. We had a meeting in Alder, and Grachev arrived with his chief of staff, commanders, and others, playing innocent, being all for peace, and asking what they could do to ensure a ceasefire. And out of the blue, they offer us to bring in 2 divisions, eventually dispatching one to Sokhumi and the other to Kirovabad, Azerbaijan. We were in shock. Shevardnadze looked at me, and then at Karkarashvili. This is an occupation plan, he told them straightforwardly. I agreed. It was an outright occupation plan, and we were expected to sign it. Then Grachev said, whatever happens next, it's all on you. He got up and walked away to take a shower or something. I tried unsuccessfully to get in touch with him later. This operation was coded by Russia's general staff as a Caucasian war. We had no guarantee that the division entering Sokhumi would not turn up in Zugdidi a couple days later, then in Kutaisi, and so on. In fact, it was an occupation threat facing all of western Georgia. The Chief of General Staff of Russia, Kolesnikov, stated in the State Duma that Sokhumi would fall within 2 or 3 days. It's detrimentally naive to think that we could defeat Russia, its entire armada, in this war. Russia, with its enormous international front, comprising of North Caucasians, the Bagramian Battalion and others, all set against us. Chechens and the Confederation, everyone was against us. Shamil Basayev, Gilayev, and everyone else, they all cut their teeth in the war against us. Of course we couldn't win. We were expecting irregular troops to arrive any day, and every day Shevardnadze inquired and saw us count every soldier. Here, 8,000 just passed Kutaisi, but only about 7,000 reached Tamishi because 1,000 bailed out down the road. Then 6,000 make it to Akaldaba, with some groups dropping out here and there. The National Guard and the Defense Ministry suffered heavy losses while unsuccessfully assaulting Akaldaba. Still, they couldn't cross over. We were really counting on help from Ochamchira. I remember sending out scouts to this bank of the Kadori River to see if they were coming. Kotegabashvili was one of my personal scouts. He went there at least 15 times, but each time his message was in the negative. They had yet to set out. The ex-president's supporters halted and camped near Kintki. Kitovani and 1,000 of his loyal troops stopped in Achikvara. His idea was to capture Tkvarcheli, not to cross over to the side. Those 100 fighters you brought yesterday from Kutaisi have played a crucial role by going into action right away. We're having explosions, demolitions, casualties, and so on every 10 minutes, though they know very well what it's all about. We were still hoping that our detachments, stuck at the gate of the city and unable to cross the bridge over the river, would somehow make it to provide some assistance. Unfortunately, that never happened. That the siege was breakable was proven by Georgi Karkarashvili's raid when he, with just 10 men, crossed the river. But of 5,000 people there, only 300 crossed the Kadori River to join him and enter Sokhumi. I kept hoping until the very end that we would keep Sokhumi, until the very end. By that time, Russians had already brought the ex-president back to Georgia. He camped in Ochemchira and Zugdidi, urging people to defy the head of state and us commanders under siege, and to disobey our orders. He also claimed to have assumed power. Then President Gamsakhurdia urged his supporters to leave Sokhumi and report to him on the pretext of returning later and resuming assaults on Sokhumi and things like that. Many did abandon their positions. A unified army command must be established, a unified army staff to take charge of all armed forces, including illegal armed formations. They must be subordinated to me as president and supreme commander of the Republic of Georgia. Never speak ill of the dead, they say, and I will not, because he, undoubtedly, served a far-reaching mission by participating in the national liberation movement. At the same time, the fall of Sokhumi was largely because of the 5 battalions defending Sokhumi and other 5 stationed along the Gumista River. Georgian battalions received Mr. Gamsakhurdia's order to leave their positions and report to him in Ochemchira. All resources were exhausted to defend Sokhumi. On the 21st, a plane with about 100 irregular troops was shot down, and so was another one with 80 soldiers over Sokhumi. After yesterday's treachery and betrayal, I've come to a dead end. I see no way out. It was treason when soldiers abandoned their positions, saying that they were following orders. Through treachery, they seized the funicular. Many young men were killed and wounded, but it was impossible to capture that elevation. We were vastly outnumbered. It was a grave case of treachery when detachments that had not even taken part in action and were well rested and armed refused to enter Sokhumi. I remember our conversations and their participants. I told one of the commanders, "We're crossing the Kadori in half an hour," and he replied, "I take orders from someone else." Seeing that, my local guardsmen and those loyal to the authorities, also some military commanders, went rogue, believing that if they entered Sokhumi, they would be shot in the back by the ex-president's supporters. They claim innocence, arguing that they had no part in those explosions and destruction. But document materials are available, how they appealed to Gamsakhurdia on September 24th, promising support, and then how Giuli called him. Thousands are coming from all over Georgia, but this will not work without Samagrela's participation. They're at the city's doorstep. Let them enter, and we'll deal with the rest later. Ask me what's going on here. It's all over. It'll be over in Senaki. You know that my roots are here. We'll get back to it once it's all over. Now is no time to argue. I've never asked you for a personal favor. Not before, not now. But if you ever need anything, if I can be of any help, I'll always be by your side. I believe it's time we all stand by Georgia. I'm telling you man to man. Now it's your call. And don't give me ultimatums here. It's not a good time for that. This is below the belt. Real men don't do that. Duty calls, and if you're planning to come, this is the best time to do it. Just do what you have to do, and we'll talk it over later. That's all I wanted to say. Your move. That evening, Gamsakhurdia held a staff meeting at his army command center in Zugdidi. He was hard-pressed to cede Abkhazia temporarily, to let all these refugees head to Tbilisi and overthrew the junta. This is the biggest misfortune plaguing Georgia, and we will not accept this treacherous capitulation agreement. All of Georgia will arise to trample down the junta and reclaim Abkhazia. How Ochumchira would fall, and everything. And now they have the audacity to accuse Shevardnadze of handing it over. But their names are documented here. Abkhazia, Gugushvili, everyone arguing against entering and providing support. There are conversations between Gamsakhurdia and his wife. It's all out in the open, on cassette tapes.
Jaba
Ioseliani came over to see Shevardnadze, and then we all went to the center of the city. The place was under heavy bombardment, practically every inch bombed. The situation was as dangerous as it could be. We did our best to keep him from going, but he resisted. He really let us have it. You traitors! Where's all this cowardice coming from? We hid his car keys. Suddenly a different car pulled up, and he and Jaba and others literally hopped in. We rushed after them. There was nothing we could do about it. And so we followed them to Sokhumi Center. By the way, Jaba and I walked down so as to stand in the way of the retreating battalions. We pleaded with them, "Boys, what are you doing? All is not lost. Let's go back together. We'll stay with you. We're coming with you." No, they had made up their minds already. It was literally raining bombs and bullets. They jumped out of the car and physically tried to stop the fleeing soldiers. "Get back to your positions, all is not lost, not yet. Reinforcements are on their way." Just like that, running after them in the streets and stopping them. Unfortunately, panic was too overwhelming and things had gotten out of hand. Wait, was that a gunshot? We went back to the command center. Where's Giuli? Giuli was in his office. Now there's nothing I can do. We have just 3 tanks outside and like 10 or 15 men. Gia said, "I'm taking these tanks to break the siege and extract Giuli." The building was already under siege. He tried, but it didn't work. He couldn't break through. Those were the last days before the fall of Sokhumi. He really did not want to leave, but somehow we extracted him. He told us point blank, "Until you bring out Shartava, I'm not going anywhere."
მაშინ იდგა საკითხი, შევარდნაძე უნდა გაეროში გამოსულიყო. ამ ამბავთან დაკავშირებით და გაფრენილიყო უნდა ნიუ-იორკში.
The thing is that Shevardnadze was expected to fly to New York and deliver a speech on this issue with the UN General Assembly. He was urged by all to return to Tbilisi because the whole world had to hear what was happening in Georgia, to save what little we had and avoid a total collapse, with another civil war possibly breaking out. The loss of Sokhumi was the most painful, regrettable, and tragic experience in my life. When I saw that it was all over, that Sokhumi was lost, with no chance to turn the tables on the Abkhazian issue at that point. Yeltsin called him. I can send an airplane over to evacuate you. No need, Shevardnadze replied. I know it unnerves you to see me here. But why kill people? For what? I must be standing in your way. I don't know what Yeltsin said, but Shevardnadze replied, I'm not going anywhere, and I don't need your plane. Yeltsin promised to cease fire for 2 hours and send an airplane. I was present in his office during that conversation. Then Shevardnadze hung up and said, to hell with him.
How
he survived and made it out of Sokhumi, that remains a mystery to me. I still can't wrap my head around it because at that time, Sokhumi was as good as lost. There was this village near the airport, Abkhazia, from where they were shooting pretty much everything that moved. It's a different story what it took us and what we went through to find pilots in Sokhumi. I guess even his security guards were afraid to board that plane. They eventually crossed the Kadori Pass on foot. Pilots and much of the personnel, including from our groups, jumped in available trucks and took off. Only a few of us remained, every man for himself, as it were. Our airplane happened to have been hit with a bomb the night before. We were forced to find a way to start outdated aircraft. It actually sounds like a movie based on a true story. The way we flew off aboard that outdated plane was totally unexpected. The wind was penetrating through every opening and hole, the ceiling was leaking, and there was a pool of water on the floor, probably accumulating as a result of raining and snowing for who knows how long. Quite the plane we had.
Those
were difficult days, very difficult. Not many heads of state can boast of being with their people on the front line in times like these. It must be a special moment in Shevardnadze's big story in politics and life.
Maze bolo დღეს აი როდესაც Sokhumi დაეცა მიდიოდა ნადირობა წინა დღეებშიც და არსებობს უამრავი.
He was hunted before and during the fall of Sokhumi. There are numerous taped conversations and radio communications implicating Abkhazians, Russians, various services. Where is he now, they would ask, with the word he standing for Shevardnadze, replaced with a code name. He's over there. Don't let him slip away. It was a real manhunt.
პილოტმა განაცხადა თითქოს რადიო გადაჭერა მოხდა რომ ესეთი იყო ბისტრა სიდო.
The pilot intercepted a radio communication. Hurry up, the gray hair is getting away. They fired 2 projectiles. I saw them. I was looking down, but they rocketed faster than anything I ever saw.
ისე სწრაფად აიღო სიმაღლე, გაუცებულები ვიყავთ, მე ესეთი რამე არ მინახია.
I remember the blank expression on Shevardnadze's face aboard the plane.
მე მოხდა ისე რომ უკვე ფოთის თავზე ვიყავით, გამოვიდა
Here's what happened as we were flying over Poti, as announced by our flight engineer. Fleeing Sokhumi, defeated, leaving one's own land, at a loss for words, was a heavy cross to bear. So many people died there, including our colleague, Vova Muradov, who supplied us with clothing and personal care over those last days, because we had flown to Sokhumi very unexpectedly, dressed casually, unable to grab our personal effects. Add to that the impressions from what we saw over those last few days: death, devastation, people in distress. It's very hard to describe and speak about, emotionally draining. To add insult to injury, we found ourselves dealing with another conundrum when the pilot announced that we couldn't land in Poti. The runway is too short, and we don't have enough fuel to make it to Kutaisi. Just one option left, Batumi, Ajara. As we were about to land in Batumi, he asked, "Try not to let anyone know I'm here." We made arrangements to keep him incognito. We deplaned and the welcoming party asked, "Who's on board?" I had one of my guys, a special forces member, bandage his arm. "We have wounded soldiers," I replied. "All right." We filled up our gas tank and they may have suspected who he was. One way or another, his identity was kept secret. Apparently, he didn't trust anyone at that point. Arriving in Tbilisi turned out to be even worse than leaving Sokhumi. We landed and set foot on Tbilisi soil, an overwhelming experience that saw a sudden outpouring of our emotions that had been pent up. We burst out crying, wailing. Unbelievable memories, too painful to remember. Wars are meant to be won or lost, but it's also about preserving dignity. Now, how do I report to the parliament? Half of the MPs are from the opposition. What will I do? I can't just brush it all off, can I? So I just got up and went to the parliament. Despite the difference of political opinion, the whole assembly rose to its feet and broke into applause to welcome him. Humane disposition gained the upper hand. They knew what I had been through, and one needs encouragement and support at such moments. On behalf of our church and believers, I would like to reaffirm our deepest gratitude and admiration for you, for the example of the spirit of unmatched heroism given to us. You have become a role model for both the lay people and the clergy, and our nation deeply appreciates your self-sacrifice.
He was
always between Skyla and Charybdis. That's what those finding fault with him usually say. And even though he was between Skyla and Charybdis, he, being a politician of his caliber, was the one to find a solution. And finding a solution was very difficult. Even the greatest politicians have their darkest hours with no silver lining in sight, when it's impossible to foresee everything. Read Churchill's or Roosevelt's memoirs, and you'll see that these things do happen. There was one reason why he avoided speaking out about it, citing document materials. It could exacerbate the civil confrontation. Let's wait, time will show. This was his vision. In hindsight, after the war, it appeared to me that we might have avoided it, but was it really possible to avoid this war? This was the only way things were meant to unfold. Georgia's liberation from the dire circumstances under the empire's rule was a most difficult process. Of course, the empire would not roll out the red carpet and bid us farewell. The Russo-Georgian War, this undercover war, continues. Do you know what Grachev has said? Grachev was a minister, an army general. He said, "We cannot give up Abkhazia. If we do, we will lose the Black Sea." Did they lose Crimea, Sevastopol, also Ilyichovsk? Didn't they? And all they had left was a port of Novorossiysk, and even that was not good enough to operate year-round. And now they needed Abkhazia, a strategic necessity. But what about Georgians? Why did they carry out their cleansing? Why did they drive them away? And there were other ethnicities living in Abkhazia besides Georgians. They threw out 300,000 people. Many were slaughtered, beheaded, their severed heads kicked around for sport. All this was sanctioned by Russians to make sure that Georgians would never return. As long as Georgians remained, Russia could not use Abkhazia to access the Black Sea. This was their main concern.
შავ ზღვაზე გასასვლელად აფხაზეთს. ეს იყო უმთავრესი ინტერესი.
Have you heard people say that Shevardnadze sold Abkhazia? But for how much and to whom? What does it mean, sold, anyway?
თვითონვე კარგად იციან, რომ ეს ისეთი სისულელი ამაზე რა უნდა ისთვის გაყინდა რა.
They know themselves that it's nonsense. Why would he sell it? What would be his gain? The government in Abkhazia was hanging in the balance after this tragedy, and so was all of Georgia. Russia was ready to take the country apart, and needless to say, Shevardnadze's personal fate was totally at stake. Why would Shevardnadze want to fail while being on the ground in defense of a very possible death in a Grad missile attack? He should try hard to come up with something this absurd. It was more challenging there than during the terrorist attacks here. There, you're shelled with Grad rockets on a daily basis. But Providence, seeing that you're in the right, must be sending heavenly forces to your aid. I have a question. If passage to Zugdidi was cleared, why were all these refugees from Sokhumi forced to take the Svaneti route, which eventually claimed so many lives? Why? Was it not easier to let them through Zugdidi? What forced them to go through this hell, this path to Golgotha? Betrayal is the answer.
თან ის ხალხი ლაპარაკობს, მე ახლა არ მინა ამ თემაზე ლაპარაკი, რომლებიც მე ტელეფონში ჩვენ ახლა უშიშროების შეფი
And the same people who say these things now, though I don't want to get into details, I was in charge of security at that time, and it was my duty to keep track of particular conversations. We intercepted radio communications with them, congratulating each other on the fall of Gagra. They were over the moon when Gagra and Sokhumi fell, because this was a blow to Shevardnadze. Do you see the level of degradation? There are many theories out there, like this one did this, and someone else did that, and it's so easy to justify yourself in retrospect, to twist some minor detail and distort the broader picture. Unfortunately, we have been unable to get to the bottom of this issue and to tell the truth to the public. For some reason, historians tie this issue to a criminal case with volumes on file, and with Aladishvili as presiding judge. It's all written and analyzed in those files, and a verdict has been delivered too.
Every
time a tragic event takes place in the country, it must be scrutinized and errors must be pinpointed to ensure against repeating them in the future, for one. To date, this remains one of the weakest points of our statehood. The truth is still somewhere out there, but the public has a very vague idea of it. My Julie. My son and brother, my fellow struggler and like-minded person. No one can speak about you today and hold back his emotions. We are all at a loss for words. I extend my deepest sympathy to Abkhazia, our Abkhazia, our Georgian Abkhazia, to save which you have paid the ultimate price. Your courageous, beautiful face shows bullet wounds. Georgia will not fall apart. Georgia will not fade away and sink into oblivion as long as it has sons like you. I'm not saying goodbye. You will always remain alive for Georgia.
ყოველთვის იმას ვამბობ, რომ SNG-ში შესვლა თუ გინდაც, ეს არ არის Shevardnadze's strategy.
I always say that joining the CIS was never Shevardnadze's strategic choice. It was a choice between annihilation and life-saving resuscitation that underpinned his decision. Because without joining the CIS, Georgia would have surely split in two, at least in two, and then there would have been a further escalation of this conflict throughout Georgia. With the Soviet Union dead and buried, the CIS is, and always was, nothing but some economic union. Russians needed some kind of policy to ensure against becoming completely weakened territorially. So it seemed like an amazingly prudent decision. With the Civil War over, joining the CIS actually saved Georgia.
Shevardnadzes იმ მომენტში ნამდვილად სხვა გამოსავალი არ ქონდა.
At that time, Shevardnadze really had no choice. Not that he wanted to turn back to Russia and its orbit, nothing of this kind. And history later proved Shevardnadze right when he continued and persisted on the path to the West, a process that started 35 years ago. At that time, however, the country hung in the balance, with the Civil War and so on, facing a real threat of disintegration. Consequently, there was no other way out, no option to regulate the situation temporarily. And this is why he took this step. It's just that I would have found it impossible to do if I were still in my official capacity. Security Minister Irakli Batiashvili resigned. I was in Moscow at that time. I had a run-in with Yeltsin. He just drew a line splitting Georgia's map in two and said, "You keep this half and let him have the other." Then I returned to learn that Poti had been captured.
I
was in Samtredia. We had a meeting there. In parallel, gang-like formations were devising an assault. Eduard Shevardnadze served as Kitovani's representative in the Defense Ministry. I was Deputy Security Minister. Shevardnadze arrived to chair the meeting. We were looking for ways to resolve this crisis situation. Some argued that we had enough troops to dispatch. I told him, "Mr. Shevardnadze, our capabilities are down to zero. We cannot expect our forces to offer any resistance." That day, Avto Iosiliani was appointed security minister. But later on the same day, Shevardnadze reversed his decision and appointed Eduard Shevardnadze instead. What happened?
Eduard Shevardnadzes დანიშნვა მოხდა რა?
მოდი გაიხსენეთ ის დრო, როცა ეს მოხდა. ფოთი გაძარცულია.
Let's go back to the time when it happened. Poti was captured, plundered, and pillaged. You know what forces were involved in this. Georgia was unable to receive wheat sent by her friends, nor did it have access to supplies of flour, butter, or anything to sustain itself. All we had could see us through for just a few days. Without reopening access to Poti, the rest of Georgia would starve to death. So there I was thinking, whom should I call? So I decided to call Kravchuk, Ukraine's president at that time. People in Georgia are unaware of this conversation. I told him I'm on a rocky road, and I'm not talking about myself. The whole nation is in grave danger. Starvation is around the corner. We have no supplies. We need you to send Admiral Baltin to Poti, just symbolically, so that we may be able to receive ships in Poti. The blockade of Poti is unacceptable to both Russia and Georgia, because it will trigger new waves of disorder and will ultimately cost Russia and Georgia dearly. Have you tried calling Yeltsin? If not, can you get in touch with him? He asked. At the time, the Black Sea Fleet was under dual Russian-Ukrainian jurisdiction, though now it's different. I can't call him, I replied. That's all right, he said. Let me handle this. I'll call you back in an hour and a half. He called back and said, I've issued an order to Admiral Baltin, and the ships will sail tonight. They should be in the Poti port in the morning, the day after tomorrow, the latest. The next morning, Admiral Baltin and his armada sailed out. By saying armada, I don't mean hundreds of ships and cruisers. Under the circumstances, it was of vital importance, though. Besides sending ships, they assumed control over half of the city to ensure order in Poti and safety for the inbound vessels. And I must admit that not a single soldier from Admiral Baltin's forces took part in any of the military operations. It was a historic event in the life of Georgia. The map drawn by Grachev and presented to me by Yeltsin, the one splitting Georgia in two, divided between the president and the ex-president, was no longer of any use now. Ukraine saved Georgia, a country on the brink of disintegration. Poti was saved, and so was Georgia. His calculations were brilliantly precise. We all know what happens on the eve of a revolution. All measures are in place, Mr. Shevardnadze. We've insured against any possible incidents, they promise. And then they open the door and, you know the drill, we were up against something along those lines. Making those decisions was a matter of life and death, a matter of Georgia's survival. So we clutched at every straw available to avoid a catastrophe. When discussing concrete processes or events, we must bear in mind the circumstances surrounding them. I never considered Eduard Shevardnadze's appointment as a second chance given to him. No, it was a compromise, a choice between losing Western Georgia to illegal armed formations and chaos on one hand, and taking a breather in that situation on the other. That's all. Otherwise, looking at the cabinet ministers, we had Vardiko Nadabaidze for defense minister, Eduard Shevardnadze for security minister? Only Grachev missing. Icing on the cake. Neither you nor anyone else can give me that guarantee. It's sort of hard to guarantee. We can give you this guarantee, Mr. Shevardnadze. When we unite the refugees from Abkhazia, we will guarantee deliverance from Russia, and then Abkhazia will return to Georgia. It won't happen that easily. It will, trust me. We were in charge there, and you know. No, we were not. Exactly. And you will not be in charge now because they've turned to a different form to stay there. The country was struggling to deliver itself from this situation. The right strategy of domestic transformation was chosen to that end. It would make no sense to wrestle with Russia at the moment. Georgia had neither resources nor prospects of succeeding in case of a confrontation. This is a sophisticated kind of politics. Calculus of politics, I would say. Politics is the art of opportunity. You must take advantage of what is available today. You fail, you get punished, like we were when this war broke out. He is often criticized unfairly. But what would these critics do in his shoes? Has it ever crossed their minds? How would they find a way out? I know for a fact that Mr. Shevardnadze's visit to the United States in the spring of 1994 marked a turning point, namely his meeting with Mr. Clinton. Yes, they had met before, but this time it was different, in both form and purpose. Next, he goes on an international tour, visiting China, Iran, and Germany. Back then, both China and Iran were in opposition to Russia, so this tour suggested his intent to strike a balance and maintain neutrality between Russia and the countries opposed by it. There were meetings with the World Bank, the IMF, and others, resulting in plans to assist Georgia in implementing deep, far-reaching reforms. All that was preceded by Mr. Yeltsin's visit. In fact, that was the only visit by independent Russia's president. A framework agreement was signed between Georgia and Russia, a truce in a way. We were looking for a concise idea, formulated in simple terms that would lend a function to Georgia and help the country find its place in the modern world. In 1993, it was declared openly that Georgia must become a bridge between the East and the West. And it was Shevardnadze's idea to revive the Great Silk Road's route passing through Georgia. Because since the time of the Silk Road, Georgia always played a vital role in linking the East to the West, and vice versa. Many people betrayed him and failed to appreciate the geopolitical situation in the Caucasus, with scores of enemies, both internal and external, turning on the country and Shevardnadze personally. Nonetheless, he succeeded in making a political move that eventually laid the groundwork for these energy corridors. A Georgian diplomat was once told that the expected construction of energy corridors in the territory of Georgia would entail the loss of both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In 1993, I visited the European Union to discuss a set of issues. The EU's leader was also present, and I started talking about the Silk Road and its major projects. I must have baffled everyone because they gave me this puzzled look, probably thinking, this man comes here from a country plagued by a civil war, starvation. What's the Silk Road got to do with it all? But I must have been looking into the future further than the EU did. The European Union was all set, no shortage of oil, wheat, nothing. So necessity was what made us consider new projects.
გვაფიქრებინა იმაზე, რომ შეიძლება იყოს ახალი პროექტები.
This, in fact, defined a function for the region and our country. It was a move of paramount importance. If Abkhazia may be considered his failure as a state's leader, something that he really took to heart, the energy corridors were his greatest achievements, and that despite the enormous resistance he encountered. Shortly afterward, August 1995, a terrorist attack was carried out, linking directly to these developments. When a poor orator says, "In conclusion," that's the signal that the real speech, the real thing, is about to start.